I'm Major Elise Columbus, 34, an Air Force intelligence officer who built a career seeing 3 moves ahead while others celebrated their first. For years, I kept my head down, supporting a family that measured worth by the number of battles fought instead of the weight carried afterward. But when my cousin Ryan Richards laughed and asked, "What's the worst you've seen?" in front of his SEAL father, I answered honestly, and 30 seconds later, that decorated man was begging me to stop. Have you ever been dismissed or underestimated by people who should have known better? If you've had to prove your worth to the very ones who doubted you, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened that night, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up believing the Air Force was the smarter branch. That's what my mother told me anyway. She was Colonel Sandra Columbus, retired, and she'd spent 30 years proving that intelligence operations weren't about muscles or medals. They were about seeing 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still celebrating their first. I believed her because I wanted to, and because by the time I was old enough to question it, I was already committed to following her path. My cousin Ryan and I were born 6 weeks apart. His mother and mine were sisters who married military men and raised military children, which meant our childhoods were measured in duty stations and deployments rather than school years and summer vacations. Ryan's father was Commander Daniel Richards, Navy SEAL, and in our family, that title carried weight like a second surname. Commander Daniel Richards, Navy SEAL. It was always said that way, complete, reverent, as if separating the words might diminish their power. Ryan and I were close when we were young. We built forts in base housing backyards and played elaborate games where we were always on the same team, always winning impossible victories against invisible enemies. But childhood ended the way it does for military families, abruptly, with reassignments and distance, and the slow replacement of shared experiences with separate lives. By the time we were adults, we saw each other maybe twice a year at family reunions, and even then we occupied different worlds. He worked in commercial real estate in San Diego, made good money, stayed close to his parents. I joined the Air Force at 22, commissioned through ROTC, and spent the next decade becoming someone my family didn't quite understand. They knew I was Air Force. They knew I made captain at 29, which was respectable. What they didn't know, what I couldn't tell them, was that I worked in Special Operations Intelligence, coordinating surveillance operations and extraction missions across 3 continents. They didn't know about the incident cleanup, the after-action assessments, the classified briefings where I sat across from generals and explained what went wrong and why. They thought I did logistics. I let them think that. It was easier that way. My mother understood without me having to explain, and that was enough. She'd taught me early that some kinds of service don't translate well to civilian conversation, that the people who need to know will know, and the ones who don't will fill in the gaps with whatever makes them comfortable. So when aunts and uncles asked what I did, I smiled and said something vague about coordination and support, and they nodded and moved on to asking Ryan about real estate markets. The Richards side of the family treated military service like competitive sport. They had a wall in their house, I'm not exaggerating, an actual wall, covered in photographs of Daniel in uniform, Daniel with his SEAL team, Daniel receiving commendations. There were smaller photos of Ryan's grandfather, who'd been a Marine, and a few of my mother in her dress blues, but the wall belonged to Daniel. At reunions, which were usually hosted at their place, the conversation would inevitably turn to service stories. Daniel had dozens of them, carefully edited for civilian ears, but still thrilling enough to keep everyone entertained. He'd talk about training exercises and deployments and the bond between SEALs, and everyone would listen like he was describing another world, which I suppose he was. I never told stories at those gatherings. I'd learned early that my contributions didn't land the same way. The one time I'd tried to explain the complexity of coordinating multi-agency operations, I'd watched eyes glaze over before I finished the first sentence. Combat, they understood. Gunfights and explosions and physical courage, that translated. What I did which was largely about information flow and risk assessment and preventing disasters before they happened, didn't make for good dinner conversation. Ryan was different with me when we were alone. Still warm, still familial, still the cousin I'd built backyard forts with. But at reunions, especially after a few drinks, he'd slip into this performative teasing that felt designed for an audience. "Do you even carry a gun?" he asked once, grinning, and everyone laughed because it was absurd, right? The idea that someone in the military wouldn't carry a gun. I smiled and said I was qualified on several weapon systems, which was true but beside the point. The point was that Ryan had learned from his father how to measure military service, and by that measure, I came up short. Daniel never mocked me directly. He was too aware of decorum for that, too conscious of his reputation. But he validated Ryan's teasing with his silence, with small chuckles, with the subtle body language that said, "She's family and we love her, but let's not pretend she's doing what I did." I heard through my mother that he'd told people I probably do admin for the boys who fight. My mother was furious when she told me, ready to call him and correct the record, but I stopped her. There was no point. Daniel believed what he believed, and nothing I said would change that. More importantly, I was learning something valuable about respect. It's not always given where it's earned, and sometimes the people who should know better are the ones who understand the least. I made major at 33. It was a strong promotion, earlier than average, and it came with a new assignment coordinating joint operations at a forward operating location I couldn't name. My mother called immediately, proud and excited. A few other family members sent texts. Daniel sent nothing. Ryan texted 3 days later, "Congrats on the promotion. Dad says that's pretty good for Air Force." I stared at that message for a long time, trying to parse whether it was meant as compliment or qualification, and eventually decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was starting to see the pattern clearly. The Richards family, and by extension parts of my own family, had constructed a hierarchy of service that placed physical combat at the top and everything else somewhere below. It wasn't personal, exactly. It was structural, cultural, the inevitable result of decades of stories that valorized one kind of courage while ignoring others. My mother had navigated this her entire career, had learned to smile and deflect and let men like Daniel believe they occupied the moral high ground of military service. "Let it go," she told me after the promotion non-reaction. "Men like that need to believe they're the bravest in the room. It's not about you." But it was about me, in the sense that I was the one being diminished. And I was tired of it. Not angry, not resentful, just tired. Tired of the careful modesty, the strategic silence, the performance of humility required to navigate family gatherings without disrupting the comfortable mythology everyone had constructed around Daniel's service. I started to build distance emotionally, not cutting anyone off, but simply pulling back, investing less in their approval, caring less about their understanding. I knew another reunion was coming. Summer at Daniel's lake house, the usual gathering of extended family and friends and colleagues from his SEAL days who'd become part of the family ecosystem. I knew what it would be like: loud music, kids swimming, Daniel holding court on the deck with stories everyone had heard before but still wanted to hear again. I knew Ryan would be there with his easy charm and his performative teasing. I knew I'd be the quiet one in the corner, nursing a beer, smiling at the right moments, leaving early. What I didn't know was that this reunion would be different. That something Ryan said would crack open the careful silence I'd maintained for over a decade. That 30 seconds of truth would change how my family saw me forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand why I said what I said, and why Daniel reacted the way he did. You need to understand what I'd seen, and why I'd kept it hidden, and what it cost me to finally speak. The teasing started getting sharper around the time I turned 30. Ryan was doing well in real estate, engaged to a woman named Michelle who worked in pharmaceutical sales, building the kind of stable civilian life that looked attractive from the outside. I was on my second deployment-adjacent assignment in 3 years, still single, still moving every 18 to 24 months, still living out of boxes and building friendships that had expiration dates stamped on them from the start. At a reunion the summer I was 31, Ryan cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling my drink. "Serious question," he said, voice lowered like we were sharing confidences. Do you ever regret it? The whole military thing. No, I said, which was true. Really? Because you could be doing anything. You're smart, you've got a degree, you could make actual money in the private sector. He said it like he was offering advice, like this hadn't occurred to me. I like what I do, I said. But what do you actually do? Like day to day? He was genuinely curious, I think, but there was something else underneath, a need to categorize me, to fit me into a framework he understood. Coordination, I said. Analysis. Planning. So like, office work? Sometimes. He nodded slowly, processing. Dad always says the real military is the guys downrange. The ones actually in the shit. He caught himself, glanced toward the living room where kids were playing. Sorry. In the thick of it. Your dad's entitled to his opinion, I said, and left the kitchen. That conversation bothered me more than it should have. Not because Ryan was wrong, exactly. There were absolutely people downrange, in direct combat, whose experiences were different from mine. But the dismissal embedded in his words, the casual certainty that what I did didn't count as real, military service, revealed how much he'd absorbed from his father. And the thing was, Daniel didn't know. He'd spent his career in direct action, in teams that trained together and deployed together and came back together. He understood that world perfectly. What he didn't understand, what he'd apparently never considered, was that the military had other functions that were equally critical but far less visible. I started noticing how often the family deferred to Daniel's judgment on anything military-related. Someone would ask a question about current events or policy or strategy, and everyone would turn to him, waiting for the authoritative answer. Sometimes he'd gesture at me. Elise might know more about the Air Force side, but it was always perfunctory, a courtesy rather than genuine interest. The conversation would pause briefly while I offered a few sentences, then return to Daniel for the real insight. My mother saw it too. We had lunch together when I was home on leave, just the two of us at a restaurant near the base where she'd spent the final 5 years of her career. She was retired, but still connected, still attending change-of-command ceremonies and keeping up with people she'd served with. We talked around the family dynamics for a while before she finally said, "Daniel doesn't know what he doesn't know." "I'm aware," I said. "It bothers you more than it used to." It wasn't a question. "I'm tired of being patronized by someone who doesn't understand what I do." "Then stop caring what he thinks." She said it simply, like it was easy. Maybe for her it had been. It's not just him. It's the whole family dynamic. The way everyone treats his service, like it's the gold standard and everything else is a pale imitation. That's hero worship, my mother said. It's not rational. You can't logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into. So I just accept it? You accept that their opinion doesn't define your service. She sipped her water, watching me. Or you show them what they're missing. But be careful with that second option. I didn't understand what she meant by be careful until much later. At the time, I thought she was just warning me not to get emotional, not to let frustration make me careless. Now I understand she was warning me about the cost of truth, that once you show people something they weren't ready to see, you can't take it back. The promotion to major came with a new assignment, Joint Operations Liaison, coordinating between Air Force Intelligence and Army Special Operations units. It meant more visibility, more responsibility, and more classified work I couldn't discuss. The family's reaction was muted. A few congratulations texts, a card from my mother with a handwritten note saying she was proud. Ryan sent a message 3 days after the announcement. "Nice work. Dad says major is solid. Not bad for someone who doesn't like mud." That last line stayed with me. Doesn't like mud. As if my choice of branch was about preference rather than aptitude, as if my work was somehow cleaner or easier because I wasn't infantry. I didn't respond to the text. I was learning that silence could be its own form of communication, that not engaging was sometimes more powerful than defending yourself. What Ryan and Daniel didn't know, what I couldn't tell them, was that my work regularly involved reviewing after-action reports that detailed exactly what happened when operations went wrong. I read incident reports. I analyzed failure points. I briefed senior leadership on why 16 people were dead instead of alive, why a target building collapsed with civilians inside, why an extraction went sideways and left 2 Allied personnel in enemy hands for 72 hours. I didn't see combat the way Daniel had, but I saw its aftermath in forensic detail, over and over, until the accumulated weight of those reports became its own kind of burden. There was an operation in Syria that I still think about. Coalition forces targeting a high-value individual believed to be coordinating attacks against U.S. personnel. Intelligence suggested he was alone in a safe house outside Raqqa. The strike was approved, executed at 0300 hours, successful by the metrics that mattered to the people who ordered it. The target was eliminated. The building was destroyed. Mission accomplished. Except the intelligence was incomplete. He wasn't alone. There were 4 other people in that building, his wife, his sister, and 2 children under the age of 8. We didn't know until the after-action assessment, until local reports started coming in, until imagery analysts went back through surveillance footage and pieced together what had actually happened. I wrote part of that assessment. I detailed the intelligence gaps, the assumptions that turned out to be wrong, the procedural questions that should have been asked but weren't. My report was professional, thorough, focused on improving future operations. But I remember thinking, as I wrote it, about those children. About what their last moments were like when the building came apart around them. About whether they were asleep or awake, whether they knew what was happening or if it was simply over too fast for fear. That's the worst I've seen. Not the worst that exists. I know there are people who've experienced far more direct horror, but the worst I've had to document and analyze and incorporate into the machinery of military decision-making. And the thing about that kind of work is that you can't talk about it. Not because it's all classified, though much of it is, but because there's no context for it in civilian conversation. How do you explain to someone at a barbecue that you've spent the last month reviewing reports about children killed in drone strikes? How do you make them understand that this isn't about politics or morality in the abstract, but about the specific weight of specific deaths and your specific role in the system that caused them? You don't. You smile and say you do coordination work, and you let them believe that means something safe and boring, and you carry the rest of it alone. The reunion invitations came every year like clockwork. Daniel and his wife hosted in July at their lake house in upstate New York. It was beautiful property, sprawling and private, with a dock and a boathouse and enough space that 30 or 40 people never felt crowded. I usually made an appearance for 1 night, maybe 2, then invented an excuse to leave early. Work, typically. No one questioned it. Military schedules were unpredictable, and everyone understood that I couldn't always control my time. This particular year, I almost didn't go. I was between assignments, technically on leave, and I knew I'd have no excuse to leave early if I wanted one. But my mother asked me to come, said it had been too long since I'd spent real time with the extended family, and I owed her enough that I agreed. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday. The house was already full, music playing from outdoor speakers, kids running around in swimsuits, adults clustered in conversation groups that shifted and reformed like living organisms. Daniel was on the deck, grilling, surrounded by 3 of his former SEAL teammates who'd become regular fixtures at these gatherings. Ryan was there with Michelle, now his wife, and their daughter Emma, who was almost 2. The scene was exactly what I'd expected, loud, warm, comfortable in its familiarity. I made my rounds, hugged the relatives who expected it, deflected questions about whether I was seeing anyone with practiced ease. My mother pulled me aside briefly, squeezed my arm, said, "Thank you for coming." I told her it was fine, which was mostly true. I got a beer from the cooler, found a chair at the edge of the deck, and settled in to observe. That's what I'd become good at, observation without participation. I could be present at these gatherings without actually engaging, could smile and nod at appropriate moments while keeping myself slightly apart. It was a survival strategy I'd developed over years of practice, and it usually worked perfectly. What I didn't account for was that Ryan had been drinking since lunch. Not drunk, but looser than usual, more performative, playing to an audience that included his father and his father's friends. Around 9 o'clock, after most of the kids had been put to bed and the remaining adults had settled into the comfortable rhythm of evening conversation, Ryan looked across the deck and called out to me. "Come on, Major." His voice was loud, cheerful, carrying across the space. "You've been quiet all night. What's the worst you've seen?" Everyone laughed. It was clearly meant as an icebreaker, a way to draw me into the conversation, maybe a gentle tease about how I never told stories the way Daniel did. Ryan was grinning, expectant. Daniel was watching me with mild curiosity. The other SEALs had turned their attention my direction, probably assuming I'd deflect or make a joke or offer some sanitized anecdote that would satisfy the question without revealing anything real. I looked at Ryan for a long moment. Then at Daniel. Then at the collection of family and friends waiting for me to laugh it off and change the subject. I didn't laugh. I started talking. "The worst I've seen," I said quietly, and the laughter died immediately. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was just answering the question, speaking in the same calm tone I used for briefings, for after-action reports, for conversations with senior officers about operations that had gone catastrophically wrong. I was speaking the way I'd learned to speak about difficult subjects, clearly, professionally, without excess emotion. Syria, 3 years ago. Coalition strike on a high-value target outside Raqqa. Intelligence suggested he was alone in a safe house. Single-story concrete structure, isolated location, minimal collateral risk. The strike was approved at 1600 hours, executed at 0300 the next morning. Precision munition, direct hit, building destroyed. Target eliminated. I paused to take a drink. The deck had gone completely silent. Someone had turned down the music. Turns out he wasn't alone. His wife was there. His sister. 2 children, ages 6 and 8. We didn't know until 12 hours after the strike, when local reports started coming in. By the time imagery analysts went back through the surveillance footage, we could see them arriving the evening before the strike. 3 hours before we executed. Ryan's grin had faded. He was staring at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. I wrote part of the after-action assessment, I continued. Detailed the intelligence gaps, the assumptions we'd made, the procedural questions that should have been asked. My job was to figure out what went wrong so we could prevent it next time. Which meant I spent 2 weeks reviewing everything we had on that target. Every piece of surveillance footage, every intelligence report, every communication intercept. I was aware that I should stop talking, that I'd already said more than anyone wanted to hear, but something had broken open inside me, and I couldn't quite seal it shut again. There's footage from a drone 20 minutes before the strike. Thermal imaging. You can see 4 heat signatures in the building. 2 large, 2 small. We couldn't identify who they were, but we knew they were there. Someone in the chain made the decision that they were enemy combatants or acceptable collateral. I don't know who made that call. That wasn't part of my assessment. I could feel my mother watching me from across the deck, but I didn't look at her. The children's bodies were recovered by local forces 3 days later. The sister survived initially. There's hospital records from a clinic in Al-Hasaka. She died from her injuries 6 days after the strike. We have documentation of all of this because we tracked it for the assessment, for the record, so that future targeting decisions could account for what we'd learned. That's when Daniel stood up. He'd been sitting at the table near the grill, but suddenly he was on his feet, moving toward me. For a second I thought he was angry, that I'd violated some unspoken rule about what could be discussed at family gatherings. But when he reached me, his hand on my arm was gentle, and his voice was quiet. "Stop," he said. "Please stop." I stopped talking. I looked up at him. This man I'd spent years being compared to, whose service had always been held up as the gold standard against which mine was measured. His face had gone pale. His hand was shaking slightly where it gripped my arm. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "We didn't know." The whole deck was frozen. Someone's drink had tipped over, beer spreading across the table, but no one moved to clean it up. Ryan was still staring at me, but his expression had changed completely, the performative confidence gone, replaced by something that looked like horror or maybe shame. "We didn't know," Daniel said again, and I realized he wasn't apologizing for the strike in Syria. He was apologizing for the years of dismissal, for the casual mockery, for assuming my service was somehow less real or less difficult because I wasn't the one pulling triggers. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. Daniel's hand fell away from my arm and he stepped back, but he didn't sit down. He just stood there, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I should go, I said quietly. My mother intercepted me before I reached the door. Elise, I'm fine, I said, which wasn't exactly true but wasn't exactly false either. I'll text you tomorrow. She didn't try to stop me. She just hugged me, quick and fierce, then let me go. I drove back to my hotel in silence, windows down, night air cool against my face. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was just empty, hollowed out, wondering what I'd just done and whether I'd be able to put it back in the box. My phone buzzed twice on the drive. I didn't check it until I was in my room, door locked, shoes off, sitting on the edge of the bed. One message from my mother, call me when you're ready. One from Ryan, I'm sorry. I didn't call my mother that night. I turned off my phone, took a long shower, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why I'd thought answering Ryan's question was a good idea. Because it hadn't been. It had been the opposite of strategic, the opposite of controlled, the opposite of everything I'd learned about navigating family dynamics while protecting my own peace. But maybe that was the point. Maybe I'd been protecting my peace for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just tell the truth. Morning came with the particular clarity that follows bad decisions. I woke up at 0600 out of habit, showered, dressed, and sat with coffee while I decided whether to check my phone. I'd turned it off the night before and left it off, which meant I had no idea whether the family chat was exploding or whether everyone was pretending last night hadn't happened. I turned it on. 17 notifications, which was about 15 more than I'd expected. Most were texts. My mother, 3 more times asking if I was okay. Ryan, twice more apologizing. 2 aunts checking in with variations of, are you alright, honey? Daniel had sent a single message at 0200, when you're ready to talk, I'm here. I replied to my mother first, I'm fine. Heading home today. We'll call you tomorrow. Then I scrolled through the rest without responding, trying to gauge the temperature of the situation. The family dynamic had shifted. I could feel it even through text messages, through the careful phrasing and the sudden respect in how people addressed me. It was what I'd wanted, in theory, to be seen clearly, to be understood. But now that I had it, it felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's uniform. I packed quickly and checked out by 0700. The drive home was 6 hours, which gave me plenty of time to think about what happened next. Because something would happen next. Daniel's message made that clear. This wasn't over. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the whole thing fade into family history as that time Elise got intense at the reunion. But I knew Daniel well enough to know he wouldn't let it fade. He'd been shaken by what I'd said, genuinely shaken, and men like him didn't shake easily. He'd want to talk about it, to understand, to somehow make it right. I wasn't sure I wanted to give him that opportunity. Making it right would require conversations I'd spent years avoiding, would require explaining things I'd learned to keep locked away. But I also knew that my mother was right, Daniel didn't know what he didn't know. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying to teach him. I stopped for lunch halfway home at a diner off I-87, sat in a booth by the window, and finally called my mother. You left early, she said, no preamble. I needed to. I know. How are you feeling? Tired, I said, which was true in more ways than one. Did I blow up the family? No. You shook them up, which is different. Daniel is processing, she said carefully. He stayed up late talking to his friends. Apparently, one of them pulled him aside after you left and told him he'd been an ass for years. Which one? Mike. The one who was Marine Recon before he went SEAL. He told Daniel that intel is the hardest job in Spec Ops because you see everything but can't do anything about it. That was surprisingly astute for someone I'd exchanged maybe 10 words with over the years. Is Daniel angry? He's ashamed, my mother said. There's a difference. We talked for a few more minutes about logistics, when I'd be home, whether I needed anything, the usual maternal concerns. Before we hung up, she said, your father would have been proud of you last night. My father had been Air Force too, died in a training accident when I was 12. I barely remembered him, but I knew he'd understood the weight of service in ways that civilians couldn't. For what? Losing control and traumatizing a family barbecue. For telling the truth, she said simply. That takes a different kind of courage. I thought about that on the rest of the drive home. About courage and truth and the different ways we measure strength. Daniel had spent his career in environments where courage was physical and immediate, door-kicking, close-quarters combat, direct action against tangible enemies. That was real and valid and worthy of respect. But what I'd done last night required something different. The courage to be vulnerable, to show people the weight I carried, to trust that they could handle it. I hadn't planned to do it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the only way to break through years of misunderstanding was to stop carefully managing how people saw you and just let them see. I got home around 1600 hours, unpacked, and sat with the silence of my apartment. I lived alone in base housing, a 2-bedroom unit that I'd barely decorated because I knew I'd be reassigned within 18 months. It was clean and functional and impersonal, which suited my life perfectly. No one to explain things to. No one to pretend for. My phone buzzed. Ryan again. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Not today. Okay, when you're ready. I put the phone down and opened my laptop, thinking I'd catch up on email or handle some administrative work. Instead, I found myself opening a file I hadn't looked at in months, the complete after-action assessment from that Syria operation. I'd written sections of it, but I'd never read the whole thing cover to cover. I read it now. Every page. Every detail. Every recommendation for procedural improvement. It was professionally written, thorough, exactly what it needed to be for its intended purpose. But reading it with some distance, I could see what wasn't in it. The moral weight, the human cost, the accumulated grief of knowing that 4 people died because multiple links in a chain made small mistakes that compounded into tragedy. That's what civilians didn't understand about military service, especially the kind I did. It wasn't about individual heroism or dramatic moments. It was about systems and processes and the terrible responsibility of making decisions that affected lives you'd never see. Daniel understood direct action, the clarity of engagement, the simple mathematics of combat. What he hadn't understood, what I'd finally made him see, was that there were other kinds of mathematics equally brutal in their own way. A fellow officer had told me once, after a particularly difficult assessment, sometimes the truth is a weapon you don't mean to draw. I'd thought he was being dramatic at the time. Now I understood. I'd drawn that weapon at the reunion, not planning to, not wanting to, but unable to keep it sheathed once Ryan asked his question. The question was what I did with it now. Whether I let things go back to normal, let the family uncomfortable clarity fade into comfortable ambiguity, or whether I used this moment to reset relationships that had been broken for years. I wrote an email to Daniel. Deleted it. Wrote another. Deleted that one too. Eventually, I wrote a simple note by hand on Air Force stationery, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning. Daniel, thank you for stopping me the other night. I should have stopped myself, but I'm glad you were there to do it. I hope we can talk sometime when you're ready. Elise, 3 days later. I got his response. Coffee at Langley next time you're in the area? I owe you an apology. A real one. I wrote back, Roger that. 2 weeks passed before our schedules aligned. I was at Langley for a series of briefings on a joint operation assessment, and Daniel drove up from Virginia Beach where he and his wife had recently moved. We met at a coffee shop near base, neutral territory, early enough that it wasn't crowded. He looked older than I remembered. Grayer. Thinner. Still fit, still carrying himself with that SEAL confidence, but tempered somehow. He ordered black coffee and a muffin he didn't touch, and we sat across from each other at a small table by the window. I've been thinking about what you said, he started. About Syria. Daniel, let me finish. His voice was gentle but firm. I've been thinking about it, and I talked to some people who know your world better than I do. Mike, some others. And I realized I've been an arrogant ass for years. You haven't? I have. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I've spent Ryan's whole life telling him that SEALs are the tip of the spear, that direct action is where wars are won, that everything else is support. And I believe that. I still believe part of it. But I never considered what it costs to be the person who analyzes what we do, who sees all the consequences we don't stick around for. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. When you were talking that night, he continued, about those kids, about writing the assessment, I suddenly understood something I should have understood decades ago. You're not supporting us. You're cleaning up after us. You're the one who has to look at what we do and figure out where we went wrong and carry that knowledge around. It's not like that, I said quietly. It's not about blame. Maybe not for you. But for me, sitting there listening to you describe documenting dead children, all I could think was, I've done that. I've made those calls. I've been the guy who says execute without knowing everyone who's in the target building. And I've never had to face what happens after. I go home. I file my report. I move to the next mission. You're the one who has to count the bodies and write it down and live with it. His hands were shaking slightly. I'd never seen Daniel Richards show physical signs of emotion. I'm sorry, he said, for years of dismissing what you do. For letting Ryan treat your service like a joke. For never once asking what your work actually entails. For assuming that because you're not kicking down doors, you're somehow less committed or less affected by the mission. I took a breath. Let it out slowly. I appreciate that. Is it true you've been doing this for 10 years? 12, if you count the first assignment out of training. He shook his head slowly. 12 years of reading reports like that Syria one. How many total? I don't count them. But dozens? Hundreds. Enough, I said. It's enough. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Daniel said, Mike told me something the other night. He said intel is the hardest job in special operations because you see everything but can't change anything. You're there for the planning, for the assessment, for the aftermath, but not for the execution. You never get the release of action. You just accumulate weight. Mike's a smart guy, I said. He also said you probably can't talk about 90% of what you actually do, which means you've been carrying all of this alone while we make jokes about logistics. I chose this job, I said. No one forced me. That doesn't make what we did okay. He finally took a sip of his coffee, grimaced. Cold already. I smiled slightly. You ordered it 20 minutes ago. I was nervous, he admitted. Wasn't sure you'd agree to meet me. Why wouldn't I? Because I've been a patronizing ass to you for years, and you'd have every right to tell me to go to hell. That's not my style, I said. No. Your style is quiet dignity that makes the rest of us look like fools when we finally figure out what we've been missing. He met my eyes. Ryan's devastated, by the way. He's been calling me every other day trying to figure out how to apologize to you properly. He doesn't need to. He does, but that's between you two. Daniel pushed his untouched muffin aside. I want to understand better. What you do, what it costs. Not because I'm owed an explanation, but because I spent 20 years in service and apparently learned nothing about humility or respect for other people's sacrifices. So I told him. Not everything. Operational security still mattered, and there were things I couldn't discuss outside classified spaces. But I told him about the nature of my work, about coordinating between agencies and services, about reviewing operations that went wrong and trying to extract lessons that might prevent the next tragedy. I told him about the difference between direct action and analysis, about how both were necessary but required different kinds of strength. He listened without interrupting, without trying to compare experiences or find equivalencies. Just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we all think we've seen the worst until someone reminds us there's deeper hell. I don't think what I do is worse than what you did, I said carefully. It's different. You face different dangers, different pressures. Neither one is more valid. But you never pretended mine wasn't real, he said. That's the difference. I've spent years acting like your service was some kind of comfortable alternative to real, military work. And you never once challenged that, never once tried to prove me wrong. Why? Because it wasn't worth it, I said simply. You believed what you believed. Nothing I said would have changed that. Only experience could change it. And I gave you that experience by being an ass at a family reunion. You gave me the opportunity to finally tell the truth, I corrected. I chose to take it. Maybe not wisely, but I took it. Daniel smiled slightly, the first real smile of the conversation. Your mother must be proud. That's exactly something she'd say. She usually is right about these things. We talked for another hour. Not about operations or missions, but about family, about Ryan's kid, about Daniel's retirement plans. He was thinking about teaching, maybe consulting for security contractors, trying to figure out what the rest of his life looked like now that the Navy was done with him. I told him about my upcoming reassignment, about the possibility of promotion to O5 if things went well, about my own uncertainty regarding how long I wanted to stay in. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel pulled me into a brief, awkward hug. "Thank you," he said, "for your service," which I should have said years ago. "And for not giving up on me completely." "Your family," I said. "That's not optional." "Still, I appreciate it." We walked out together, stood by our cars in the parking lot. Daniel hesitated, then said, "I know this isn't my place to ask, but have you talked to anyone? About the work, about what it costs?" "I have resources," I said, which was true but incomplete. The Air Force had programs, counselors, support systems. I used them sporadically, usually after particularly difficult assessments. But mostly I just carried it, the way I'd been trained to carry it. "Okay." He didn't push. "But if you ever want to talk to someone who gets the classified world, even if I don't get your specific piece of it, I'm available. No judgment. No comparison. Just listening." "I'll remember that," I said, and meant it. I drove back to base thinking about how strange it was that it took breaking open old silence to build new understanding. That Daniel had needed to see me at my most exposed to finally recognize what he'd been dismissing. That sometimes the only way through years of misunderstanding is to risk vulnerability, even when, especially when, it's terrifying. My phone buzzed at a red light. "Ryan, Dad said you guys talked." "I'm glad. Can I call you this week?" I typed back, "Thursday evening works." 3 days later, my phone rang at 1900 hours. Ryan, nervous, talking too fast at first. He apologized for the teasing, for the dismissal, for never taking the time to understand what I actually did. I let him talk, let him get it all out. When he finally stopped, I said, "We're okay." "Really?" "Really." "But Ryan." "Yeah. Don't ever ask me what's the worst I've seen again." "I won't. I promise." We talked for a while longer, easier now, finding our way back to the cousin relationship we'd had before military service and family politics complicated everything. Before we hung up, Ryan said, "Emma's birthday is next month. Small party, just family. Would you come?" I thought about it. Thought about going back into that family space, about whether I was ready to navigate those dynamics again. Then I thought about Emma, about being the aunt who showed up, about how family wasn't optional even when it was complicated. "Send me the details," I said. "Really?" "Really." After we hung up, I sat with the quiet satisfaction of relationships beginning to heal. It wasn't complete, wasn't perfect, but it was movement in the right direction. Daniel understood better. Ryan understood better. And I'd learned that silence, while protective, could also be isolating in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. The reassignment came through 2 weeks later. Joint Command Liaison at Nellis Air Force Base. Oh, for billet, higher visibility than my previous assignment. It was a promotion track position, the kind that would either advance my career significantly or expose my limitations and stall me out. I accepted without hesitation. After years of operating in the shadows, of keeping quiet about what I did, I was ready to step into a role where my work would be more visible, more acknowledged. My mother was thrilled. Daniel sent a congratulatory text. Ryan called to say he was proud of me, that his dad had explained what the assignment meant. I packed my apartment, forwarded my mail, and prepared for another move, another fresh start. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't running from family expectations or hiding from uncomfortable questions. I was moving forward with clarity about who I was and what I'd survived and what I was capable of. The reunion hadn't broken me. It had just cracked open something I'd been protecting too carefully, and what spilled out was messier than I'd wanted, but ultimately more honest. Sometimes the truth is a weapon you don't mean to draw. But sometimes, once drawn, it clears ground that's been needing cleared for years. Time does strange things to difficult memories. 6 months after the reunion, the whole incident had taken on a different quality in my mind, less raw, more integrated into the larger story of my relationship with my family. I was settled at Nellis, working 14-hour days on joint operation coordination, earning the respect of officers who actually understood what my job entailed. It was exhausting, but satisfying in ways my previous assignments hadn't been. Daniel retired officially in November. I couldn't make the ceremony, but I sent a card and he called afterward to thank me. Strange being a civilian, he said. Don't know what to do with myself yet. You'll figure it out, I told him. Your mother says you're doing well at Nellis. Busy? Always. Good busy or bad busy? Mostly good, I said, which was true. The work was demanding but visible, my contributions acknowledged, my expertise respected. I'd found a rhythm that worked. We talked occasionally after that, never about anything too deep, just family updates and career news. He was consulting for a security firm, teaching occasional classes at a community college on leadership and tactics. Ryan's messages became more frequent too, pictures of Emma, invitations to visit that I usually had to decline because of work schedules. The relationship was different than it had been before, more authentic, but also more careful, like we were all aware of the fragility of what we'd rebuilt. I went to Emma's birthday party in March. Small gathering at Ryan and Michelle's house, just immediate family and a few of Emma's little friends. Daniel was there with his wife. My mother drove down from Albany, and a handful of aunts and uncles I hadn't seen since the reunion showed up. The dynamic was noticeably different. People asked me about work with genuine interest. Daniel introduced me to someone as my cousin Elise, who does intelligence work for Air Force Special Operations, with a pride in his voice that hadn't been there before. Ryan pulled me aside at one point while Emma was destroying her birthday cake with enthusiastic 2-year-old focus. Thanks for coming, he said. Of course. I mean it. After everything, I wasn't sure you would. Ryan, we're fine. Really? I know, but he hesitated, watching his daughter. Dad's been different since that night. More thoughtful. More aware of how he talks about service. He told me once that you taught him more about humility in 30 seconds than he'd learned in 30 years. I didn't know what to say to that. Anyway, Ryan continued, I'm glad we're okay. And I'm glad Emma will grow up knowing you. I want her to understand that there are different kinds of strength. That hit me harder than I'd expected. You're a good dad, I said. Trying to be better than I was as a cousin, he said, and squeezed my shoulder before heading back to the party. I left that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in years around my family, uncomplicated belonging. Not because everything was perfect, but because we'd survived something difficult and come out the other side with more honesty than we'd started with. Work continued to be consuming. I was assigned to review a multi-agency operation that had gone sideways in Somalia, coordinating between Air Force intelligence, Army Special Operations, and CIA assets. It was complicated, politically sensitive, and exactly the kind of assignment that would determine whether I made O5. I threw myself into it completely, working late nights and weekends, building briefings that would go to flag officers and senior civilian leadership. Captain Leon Hart, one of my colleagues, caught me in my office at 2200 hours on a Thursday. You're going to burn out if you keep this pace, he said. I'm fine. That's what everyone says before they're not fine. He leaned against my doorframe. When's the last time you took leave? I had to think about it. June. It's February. I've been busy. Take a weekend. Go somewhere. Do something that isn't this. He gestured at my computer, at the stacks of classified folders, at the evident chaos of someone who'd been living in her workspace for months. I promised I would, eventually, and he left shaking his head. But he wasn't wrong. I'd been using work as a way to avoid thinking about everything else, about the weight of the Syria assessment and dozens of others like it, about the complicated feelings around my family, about the question of what I wanted the rest of my career to look like. A week later, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Dickens, my commanding officer, called me into her office. I went prepared for feedback on the Somalia assessment, maybe questions about timeline or methodology. Instead, she gestured for me to sit and said, the O5 board meets in 4 months. Yes, ma'am. Your package is strong. Best I've seen this cycle. Thank you, ma'am. She studied me for a moment. You look exhausted, Major. I'm managing, ma'am. That's not the same as being okay. She leaned back in her chair. Off the record, are you okay? I considered lying. Decided against it. Honestly, I don't know. The work is good, I'm good at it, but sometimes I wonder how long I can keep doing this before it costs more than I want to pay. She nodded slowly. That's the question we all face eventually. The people who last in this line of work either learn to manage the weight or they burn out spectacularly. There's not much middle ground. How do you manage it, ma'am? Therapy. A good support system. Knowing when to step away from the hardest assignments and take something easier for a while. She paused. Also accepting that we're not going to fix everything, that our job is to make the next operation better than the last one, not to carry the burden of every mistake that's ever been made. That's harder than it sounds, I said. Everything worthwhile is harder than it sounds. She pulled a folder from her desk, slid it across to me. Speaking of which, new assignment possibility. Not immediate, but if you make 05, there's a billet opening at Joint Base Andrews. Deputy Director, Strategic Assessment Division. Less operational coordination, more high-level analysis and policy recommendation. I opened the folder, scanned the position description. It was a career maker slot, the kind that led to 06 and potentially beyond. It was also exactly the kind of work I'd been doing, but at a higher level, with more visibility and more responsibility. This is a good opportunity, I said carefully. It's an excellent opportunity. It's also relentless and high pressure, and will consume your life if you let it. She watched me. Take some time to think about whether you want it. You don't have to decide now. I took the folder back to my office, set it on my desk, and stared at it for a long time. This was what I'd been working toward, the logical next step in a career I'd built with deliberate focus. But I couldn't shake Leon's question, when was the last time I'd taken leave? When was the last time I'd done something that wasn't work or family obligation or carefully managed social performance? I pulled out my phone, scrolled through contacts, found Daniel's number. Elise, he answered. Everything okay? Yeah. Strange question, do you ever regret your career? Silence for a moment. Then, that is a strange question. Why? I'm being offered a promotion track position. Big opportunity. Probably what I'm supposed to want. But I'm not sure if I want it or if I'm just doing what's expected. I heard him moving, a door closing. Okay, honest answer. Please. I don't regret the career. I regret some of what it cost me. Time with my family. Relationships I didn't maintain. A version of myself that got buried under the uniform and never quite came back. He paused. But would I make the same choice again? Probably. Because I believed in the mission, and that belief carried me through the hard parts. What if the mission's right, but the cost keeps getting higher? Then you have to decide if you're still willing to pay it. There's no shame in saying no, Elise. There's no shame in choosing a different path if this one isn't sustainable. Everyone expects me to take this position. Everyone isn't living your life. His voice was gentle but firm. You don't owe anyone a sacrifice you're not willing to make. I thought about that long after we hung up. Thought about what I owed and to whom, about the difference between duty and self-destruction, about whether there was a version of military service that didn't require swallowing every hard thing whole. I didn't decide that night. But I started thinking more carefully about what I wanted rather than just what was available, and that felt like progress. The O5 board met in June. I submitted my package in March, then tried not to think about it too much while focusing on completing the Somalia assessment. The final briefing went well. Senior leadership accepted my recommendations, implemented most of the procedural changes I'd proposed. Lieutenant Colonel Dickens told me I'd done excellent work, that the thoroughness of my analysis had prevented several congressional inquiries from turning into investigations. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like adding one more weight to a collection that was already almost too heavy to carry. Results came back in July. I made 05. The promotion was effective in October, pending completion of professional military education requirements. My mother called immediately, crying happy tears, telling me how proud she was. Daniel sent a long text congratulating me and saying he'd always known I'd make it. Ryan posted something on social media about his brilliant cousin that was embarrassing but touching. I sat with the news feeling oddly flat. This was what I'd worked toward for 12 years. This was validation, recognition, career advancement. So why did it feel more like obligation than achievement? Lieutenant Colonel, soon to be Colonel, Dickens called me into her office the day after results were released. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Columbus. Thank you, ma'am. Have you thought about the Andrews position? Yes, ma'am. And? I took a breath. I need to ask a question first. Off the record. She nodded. How do you know when you're done? Not burned out, not failing, just done. She was quiet for a long moment. You know you're done when the work stops meaning anything beyond the work itself. When you're going through motions instead of making choices. When you can't remember the last time you felt anything except tired. What if you're not quite there yet, but you can see it coming? Then you make a choice before circumstances make it for you. She leaned forward. Are you telling me you don't want the Andrews position? I'm telling you I need time to figure out what I do want. And I don't think it's another assignment where I spend 18 hours a day analyzing failed operations. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. The position won't be available until next year anyway. Take your professional military education time to think about it. And Elise? Ma'am? Whatever you decide, make sure it's actually your decision. Not what you think you should do or what people expect. Your decision. I spent the next 3 months preparing for PME, wrapping up projects at Nellis, and thinking carefully about the next phase of my career. I talked to my mother, who told me she'd support whatever I chose. I talked to Daniel, who reminded me that service took many forms, and I'd already proven everything I needed to prove. I talked to Leon, who'd become a friend despite our initial professional-only relationship, and he told me bluntly that I looked exhausted and maybe I should consider teaching or training rather than operational work. The problem was that I'd built my entire adult identity around being good at this specific kind of difficult work. Stepping away felt like admitting defeat, like saying I couldn't handle what I'd signed up for. But continuing felt like choosing slow erosion over deliberate choice. In September, I attended a change of command ceremony at Langley for someone I'd worked with years earlier. Daniel was there. Apparently, he knew the incoming commander through SEAL networks. We grabbed coffee afterward, sat outside in late summer warmth. You're still thinking about it, he said. Statement, not question. Is it that obvious? You've got the same look I had before I retired. Like you're trying to calculate the exact right moment to let go. When did you know? I asked. When I realized I was more scared of staying in than getting out. When the thought of another deployment made me tired instead of eager. He sipped his coffee. When I looked at my son and couldn't remember the last time I'd been fully present for him. I don't have a son, I said. You've got a life that isn't this. Or you could have one if you chose it. But this is what I'm good at. Being good at something doesn't obligate you to do it forever. He set down his cup. You asked me once if I regretted my career. Here's what I didn't say. I regret letting the career become everything. I regret measuring my worth entirely by my service record. Because when it ended, I didn't know who I was without it. How did you figure it out? I'm still figuring it out, he admitted. But at least I'm doing it on my terms now instead of waiting for the Navy to tell me my time was up. I thought about that conversation for weeks. Thought about who I was beyond my uniform, beyond my job title, beyond my ability to write thorough assessments of operations that killed people. I'd spent so long being Major Elise Columbus, Air Force Special Operations Intelligence, that I wasn't entirely sure who else I could be. But maybe it was time to find out. In November, I declined the Andrews position. I accepted instead a training assignment at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, teaching intelligence analysis to junior officers, developing curriculum, mentoring. It was a significant step down in operational tempo, a lateral move at best in career terms. But when I thought about spending the next 3 years teaching instead of analyzing tragedy, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, relief. My mother said I was making a brave choice. Daniel said I was making a smart one. Ryan said he was just glad I'd be less stressed and maybe would visit more often. Lieutenant Colonel Dickens called me into her office one final time before I left Nellis. I heard about your decision, she said. Yes, ma'am. Good for you. She stood, extended her hand. Takes more courage to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. In this case, easier wrong would have been taking a position you didn't want because it looked good on paper. You're not disappointed? Why would I be? You're an excellent officer who's choosing to invest in the next generation instead of burning out in assessment work. That's admirable, not disappointing. We shook hands, and I left her office feeling like maybe I'd made the right choice after all. The move to Maxwell happened in January. I settled into a smaller apartment, a slower pace, a job that ended at 1,700 hours most days. I started running again, something I'd abandoned years ago because work consumed all my energy. I read books that weren't classified reports. I visited Ryan and his family twice in the first 3 months, actually relaxed during the visits instead of counting hours until I could leave. In March, Daniel invited me to speak to a class he was teaching at the community college, Introduction to Military Leadership. I agreed, drove to Virginia Beach, spent an hour talking to 20 students about intelligence work and decision-making and the difference between courage and recklessness. Afterward, Daniel and I grabbed dinner at a seafood place near the beach. He looked better than he had at retirement, less gray, more relaxed, like civilian life was agreeing with him. "You were good in there," he said. "Natural teacher." It felt good, I admitted. Different than briefing senior officers, but good. "You made the right call, taking the Maxwell assignment." "You think so?" "I know so. You look like yourself again." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I didn't ask. We talked about his consulting work, about Ryan's business, about Emma, who is now 3 and apparently never stopped talking. Easy conversation between family members who'd figured out how to be honest with each other. As we were leaving, Daniel said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For that night at the reunion. I know it cost you saying what you said, but it changed things. Changed me. Made me a better father, a better man." He paused. "Made me understand that strength comes in different forms, and sometimes the strongest thing is admitting what you don't know." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Anyway," he continued, "I'm glad we're here. Glad you're doing better. Glad we figured out how to be family again." "Me too," I managed. I drove back to Alabama thinking about transformation, about how sometimes the worst moments break open space for better ones, about how telling the truth, even when it's messy and difficult, can reset relationships that have been broken for years. I wasn't the same person I'd been before the reunion. But maybe that was the point. Maybe growth required breaking old patterns, especially when it was uncomfortable. The teaching assignment turned out to be exactly what I needed. I was good at it, found satisfaction in watching junior officers develop skills that would keep them alive and effective in the field. I mentored several younger women who were considering intelligence career paths, told them the truth about what the work entailed, helped them understand that they didn't have to choose between service and sanity. One of them asked me once, "Do you regret your career choices?" "No," I said, and meant it. But I'm glad I learned to make different choices before it was too late. That felt like the right answer. Not perfect, not without cost, but honest and earned. I grew up believing the Air Force was the smarter branch, following my mother, Colonel Sandra Columbus, into a career built on intelligence rather than physical force. My cousin Ryan and I were born 6 weeks apart, raised in military families that measured childhood in duty stations instead of school years. His father was Commander Daniel Richards, Navy SEAL, a title always spoken complete and reverent, carrying weight like inherited nobility. Ryan and I were close as children, building backyard forts and winning imaginary wars together. But military life fragments relationships through reassignments and distance, and by adulthood we occupied separate worlds. He sold real estate in San Diego while I became Major Elise Columbus, Air Force Special Operations Intelligence, coordinating surveillance operations and extraction missions I couldn't discuss. My family thought I did logistics. I let them believe that. The Richards side treated military service like competitive sport. Their house had an entire wall dedicated to Daniel's SEAL career, photographs, commendations, proof of excellence. At reunions, usually hosted at their place, Daniel told carefully edited combat stories while everyone listened like he was describing another dimension. I never shared stories. The one time I tried explaining multi-agency coordination, eyes glazed over before I finished. Combat translated to civilian conversation. Intelligence analysis didn't. Ryan teased me differently when we were alone, still warm, still familial. But at gatherings, especially after drinking, he'd perform for an audience. "Do you even carry a gun?" he asked once, grinning, and everyone laughed. I smiled and mentioned weapons qualifications, but the point wasn't about facts. The point was that Ryan had learned from his father how to measure military service, and by that measure, I came up short. Daniel never mocked me directly, too aware of decorum. But he validated Ryan's teasing with silence and small chuckles, with body language that said, "She's family and we love her, but let's not pretend she's doing what I did." I heard through my mother that he'd told people I probably do admin for the boys who fight. My mother was furious. I stopped her from calling him. There was no point. I made major at 33, a strong promotion. My mother called immediately. Daniel sent nothing. Ryan texted 3 days later, "Congrats on the promotion. Dad says that's pretty good for Air Force." I stared at that message, trying to parse whether it was compliment or qualification, eventually deciding it didn't matter. What mattered was recognizing the pattern. The family had constructed a hierarchy placing physical combat at the top and everything else below. My mother had navigated this her entire career, learning to smile and deflect. "Let it go," she told me. "Men like that need to believe they're the bravest in the room." But I was tired of careful modesty, strategic silence, the performance required to avoid disrupting comfortable mythology. I started building emotional distance, caring less about their approval. The summer reunion at Daniel's lake house was exactly what I expected. Loud music, kids swimming, Daniel holding court with his SEAL teammates. Around 9 o'clock, after most children were in bed and adults had settled into comfortable evening conversation, Ryan called across the deck. "Come on, Major. You've been quiet all night. What's the worst you've seen?" Everyone laughed. It was meant as an icebreaker, gentle teasing. Ryan was grinning. Daniel watched with mild curiosity. They expected me to deflect or make a sanitized joke. I didn't laugh. I started talking. "Syria, 3 years ago," I said quietly, and the laughter died. "Coalition strike on a high-value target outside Raqqa. Intelligence suggested he was alone in a safe house. Single-story concrete structure, isolated location, minimal collateral risk. Strike approved at 1600 hours, executed at 0300. Precision munition, direct hit, building destroyed. Target eliminated." The deck went completely silent. Someone had turned down the music. Turns out he wasn't alone. His wife was there. His sister. 2 children, ages 6 and 8. We didn't know until 12 hours after the strike. I wrote part of the after-action assessment. Detailed the intelligence gaps, the assumptions we'd made. My job was figuring out what went wrong so we could prevent it next time. Which meant 2 weeks reviewing everything, every piece of surveillance footage, every intelligence report, every communication intercept. I couldn't stop talking now that something had broken open inside me. There's footage from a drone 20 minutes before the strike. Thermal imaging. For heat signatures. Too large, too small. Someone in the chain decided they were enemy combatants or acceptable collateral. The children's bodies were recovered 3 days later. The sister survived initially, hospital records from a clinic in Al-Hasaka. She died from her injuries 6 days after. We documented all of this for the assessment, for the record, so future targeting decisions could account for what we'd learned. Daniel stood up suddenly. I thought he was angry that I'd violated some unspoken rule. But when he reached me, his hand on my arm was gentle. "Stop," he said quietly. "Please stop." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. We didn't know." The deck was frozen. Daniel's hand shook where it gripped my arm. He wasn't apologizing for Syria. He was apologizing for years of dismissal, for assuming my service was somehow less real because I wasn't pulling triggers. I left shortly after. In the hotel room, I lay awake wondering why I'd thought answering Ryan's question was strategic. It wasn't. But maybe I'd been protecting my peace so long I'd forgotten what telling the truth felt like. 2 weeks later, Daniel reached out. We met for coffee. He apologized sincerely, admitting he'd never respected Air Force intel the way he should have. "We all think we've seen the worst until someone reminds us there's deeper hell," he said. He'd realized something crucial. I wasn't supporting combat operations. I was cleaning up after them, documenting consequences others didn't stay to witness, carrying knowledge they'd never have to hold. The family dynamic shifted permanently after that night. I was no longer underestimated, no longer dismissed. Daniel and Ryan learned what my service actually entailed and cost. Years later, Daniel would tell his college students about different kinds of courage, using me as his example of the officer who did hard work no one saw and never asked for recognition. 5 years after the reunion, I was lieutenant colonel at Nellis, leading joint intelligence operations and training analysts. I'd found balance, enough operational work to feel useful, enough distance to maintain perspective, enough teaching to build something beyond damage assessment. The family had healed completely. Daniel taught full-time. Ryan's business thrived. Emma grew up understanding that courage meant different things in different contexts. I retired at 44, not a general or famous, just a solid officer who'd trained good people and learned when to step back. At my ceremony, Daniel told me that night at the lake house had been the most important moment of his retirement, when he finally understood who I was and what my service had cost. The silence after I spoke never really ended. It just became the foundation for everything that followed, the respect I'd been owed all along, earned through quiet confidence and eventual honesty. I'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing is simply telling the truth about what service really costs. The silence after honest speech wasn't emptiness. It was respect. And that made all the difference. That's where I'll leave it. I said 30 seconds of truth and everything changed. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a boundary story tonight. Questions for you. Have you ever been laughed at until you told the truth and the room went quiet? When family dismisses your work, do you stay silent or correct them? Why? If you've served any branch or role, how do you decide what to share with civilians? What's the one boundary you wish you'd set sooner with relatives? In my place, would you have answered Ryan or walked away? What's the worst you've seen? Question you'll never ask again. Drop your answers in the comments. I'm reading every one.